Hey everybody, quick video for you today. I'm going to continue the trend of videos that I've been putting out recently, critiquing arguments, biblical arguments that proponents of penal substitution put forth. Today we're going to be looking at a not quite as common argument for penal substitution, but I have heard it at least a couple of times. I came across it when I was writing my book on the atonement, and the argument goes something like this. So for clarification, penal substitution generally has the idea that God had all this wrath directed towards humanity because of our sin. We broke God's law. God was really mad at us, and God couldn't just forgive us without, directing that wrath and pouring it out and satisfying His justice in that way. And so, luckily, Jesus comes in. God pours out His wrath on Jesus at the cross, and bada bing, bada boom, we're good to go. Now, here's one form of argument that someone might put forth in favor of this idea that God poured out wrath on Jesus. They go to something like Mark 14:36. And this is Jesus. He says, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but you will. So the advocate of penal substitution is going to say, well, what's this cup that Jesus is referring to drinking? And then they're going to go back and they're going to point to sections in the prophets, such as Jeremiah and Isaiah, that refer to God's wrath as a cup, or a cup being filled with God's wrath. So, for instance, we see this in Jeremiah 25:15. Thus the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me, take from my hand this cup of the wine of wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. We see this in Isaiah 51:17. Wake yourself, stand up, O Jerusalem. You have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, who have drunk to the dregs the bowl, the cup of staggering. And so the argument is, hey, Jesus says he's going to drink this cup. Elsewhere in Scripture, we know this cup that the Father gives people to drink, it's wrath. Therefore, the cup that Jesus drinks from, that he references in Mark, that he wants to pass from him, it's about wrath. And like many arguments for penal substitution, if you don't look too closely at face value, this seems somewhat plausible. However, there are two problems with this style of argument. I'm going to classify it as a minor argument, a minor issue, and a major issue. So the minor issue is, while the language of cup is associated with God's wrath in the Old Testament and those passages that I just cited, like that is something that shows up, the idea of a cup being associated with God or with humanity, that's also presented in ways that, kind of motif or that metaphor, that imagery, that's presented in ways that have nothing to do with wrath. So, for instance, Psalm 116:13 says, I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. Psalm 23:5 says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Obviously, in this instance, this is a rejoicing that his cup overflows. This is not something to be dreaded, that his cup is filled with wrath or something like that. And so it is, at least at face value, it seems sloppy to say, okay, there's this cup that Jesus is talking about, therefore I'm justified in importing these sections from the prophets and what that has to do with wrath. So this is a minor issue. We need to be more careful there. But there's a bigger issue with this. It's going to be what I call the major issue. Let's go read Mark 10:39. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. So let's follow the penal substitutionary logic here. Let's see the hole that they've backed themselves into at this point. The cup that Jesus drinks from is God's wrath that has been stored up against all humanity. It's all humanity's wrath. Jesus drinks from it. Now, Jesus says the disciples are also going to drink from that cup. So according to penal substitutionary logic, that means that the disciples also, God poured out his wrath on the disciples. All the wrath that humanity had built up, God poured out that wrath on the disciples. And so actually, according to the PSA logic, Jesus didn't suffer the suffering. He didn't endure the suffering or the punishment for all of humanity. He only endured the suffering and the punishment for all of humanity, minus the disciples, because the disciples, really unfortunate for them, they still had to face, the wrath of God. Now, I think this should strike us all as being patently ridiculous. God did not pour out his wrath on the disciples. The disciples weren't co-redeemers with Jesus and in bearing the wrath of God or something like that. This is silly. I think the proponent of penal substitution should recognize that they have moved too quickly in trying to say that the cup from which Jesus drank is the wrath of God, because otherwise they are going to be forced into this, I think, quite silly position of saying that God poured out his wrath on the disciples when they also, faced martyrdom and things along those lines. Whether what we should do is we should recognize when Jesus says in Mark 10:39 that, hey, you guys are also going to drink from this cup from which I have drank, he's talking about suffering, he's talking about persecution, and So if we can understand the cup the disciples drink from, like that's him, it's just an idea of saying, hey, you're also going to, suffer, be persecuted, stuff like that. That's a theme that shows up elsewhere in Scripture. We can recognize that when Jesus is saying, Father, let this cup pass from me if it be your will, but not your will, my will be done, something along those lines. When Jesus says that, we can say, yeah, the cup that he's wanting to be passed from him there, it's just the upcoming suffering. It's the upcoming persecution. Jesus is about to be crucified, and so this argument for penal substitution, it doesn't work. It's creative. Again, if you squint your eyes and you don't look too closely, it seems to have some teeth. But once you recognize the ways that the idea of a cup is used both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, it becomes just patently ridiculous to have to be forced to this logic of saying that God poured out his wrath on disciples. So you might be thinking, yeah, well, hey, I have all these other great arguments for penal substitution from Scripture. I've got stuff like Isaiah 53. I got this idea of Jesus paying our debt. If you're thinking things like that, I would encourage you to go to my YouTube profile and go to my playlist on penal substitution. It's like penal substitution / atonement, something like that. I've made quite a few videos going in depth into these and addressing these specific arguments that advocates of penal substitution try to go to. So before you put something like that in my comment section, go check that playlist and see that it's been there. Also, if you've already picked up my book, there are some things that I address in that book that I haven't made videos about. For instance, the idea of propitiation in Romans 3, the idea of Levitical sacrifices. Those are things I touch on in my book. So anyways, I hope everybody's doing well. Like I said, I'm going to keep this video short for today. So God bless.